Welcome to Virtualize Everything. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to install Joplin Server. Now, Joplin Server is different than Joplin Desktop or Joplin Note in ways that it is the actual server that Joplin will synchronize with to store in an encrypted manner your notes. We're going to use Docker to set up Joplin Server, and we're actually going to do that inside of a Proxmox container, as this is my desired way of running Docker. So in a previous video, we created a container that ran Docker here on Proxmox. For this video, we're going to clone that. If you need to know how to create the video, go back and watch that other video. I'll provide it above here in the link. So by doing this, we'll go ahead, select the image that we want to clone. I've already converted it to a template, as you can see here. If you needed to convert this as to a template as it wasn't covered in the video, you would hover over the image and you'd convert to template. Alternatively, you can follow the same steps by just pressing clone. So for my template, I'm going to go down, right click on it and click clone, and I'll get our clone window. If you don't have a template, you're going to want to do a full clone, but since we have a template, we're going to do a linked clone. Linked clones share all of the image sizes and everything coming from the host clone so that they work a little bit faster, set up a little bit faster, but they have the negative of if the host clone gets deleted, they will not work anymore. Now we can just give this a name. We're going to call ours Joplin, and I'll just call it VE for the video here today, and we're going to hit clone. Our Proxmox system will make this clone quite quickly. All it's doing that, it'll give us a question mark here. We can go in, go to resources, go to memory here, and we're going to want to give this 2 gigs. So we'll enter 2048 here. And at least for the initial configuration process, I like to give it 2 CPU cores. It does quite a bit of work, and I'll turn it down to 1 after it's actually set up. So now that we have our machine all set up here, we can go ahead and press start, and we can go into our console and start working with it. Now that we have this set up, we'll go ahead and log in, and that password's going to fail here. So now that we have this all set up, we'll go ahead and log in. And since we're logged in, we can start with the configuration process of this Joplin server. Now, the first thing I'm going to need to do is to create some files for Joplin's Docker stuff to run in, or live in rather. So the first one we're going to do is a mkdir for Joplin inside of our operations folder. And then we want to go to that newly created file with cd. And inside of that newly created file, we're going to need to create 2 more files for Nginx once we start configuring that. The first one is going to be inside of a separate folder for Nginx, and it's going to be our logs file. And the second one is going to be for our configuration setup, and we're going to call that config-d. And again, we're using mkdir for this entire process. Now it's going to be time to start moving our configuration files over to go ahead and get Joplin up and running. I will be using a env file, and the first thing I need to do is get a little piece of information since we're using DHCP here for this tutorial, and that's going to be my IP address. So I'm going to enter IPA, and it's going to show me my IP address is 192.168.0.6. If you used static and configured that inside of your network file by going to networks, clicking on network, and then hitting edit, and then pressing static, you would use whatever we configured here as a static IP address. But again, I'm using DHCP here today just to make this tutorial a little bit easier. So to make this env file, we're just going to use sudo nano, and then we're going to call this file .env, and now this is going to be inside of our Joplin folder, inside of the ops folder, where we cd2 to create all the Nginx configuration files a moment ago. We'll be using Nano for this, as I feel a little bit more comfortable with that than Vim, and we're going to copy over our configuration. Now, the only one here I will be editing is the IP address for the sake of this tutorial, but I do suggest you go ahead and enter the password here to something different, as that isn't a very secure password. We'll save this file and then go ahead and move on to creating the Docker Compose file. And again, Docker Compose uses a YAML file, so we'll use Nano to create a file called Joplin Docker Compose.yml, and then we're going to go ahead and bring in our configuration file here. Now, our configuration file will look a little bit different because we're using that env file to store variables. So what we're going to have to do is change our environment calls to equal what it is in the env file. And that's what you can see the edits I've done here, as well as that base URL that we configured for the IP address there a moment ago. All the rest of this can stay the same because we'll be using those external variables to configure them that was placed in the env file. So we'll just go ahead and save this file. You can also notice that we have 3 different operations here: the Joplin server, the database for the Joplin server, as well as Nginx for a front proxy to pass to the server. The last step that we're going to need to do is add one more configuration file in here for Nginx. So we're going to do the @/Nginx. So it'll take our current directory, it'll move us to the Nginx folder we created, and we're going to call that the Joplin server.config. And this is going to configure Nginx as a proxy. So we'll go ahead, open that at this time, and we'll take a look at the configuration file that I'm bringing in. And here on this configuration file, we're also going to have to enter the current IP address for this container. And basically, we're listening on port 80 and port 8080 for a call to the server name or server IP address, which is 192.168.0.6. We give it an output in case there's an error message where it can go ahead and log that. And then we tell it the location of the server, which is on the same container, but it's going to be at port 8080 for the Joplin container. And then we just do a little bit of configuration for the proxy. So now we can go ahead, save this file, and our entire Joplin server is set up and ready to start. So to start it, we're going to go ahead and issue a Docker Compose command, and this Docker Compose command is also going to tell it where the env file is. Now, you don't traditionally have to do this if it is inside of the Joplin folder, but it is good practice to go ahead and call it out. So we're telling Docker Compose that we are using an env file. Then we tell it that we want to have a new startup, clean startup, and we also tell it the name of the YAML file, and then we want to start it up. Now, you can notice I dropped the -D for this first startup here. That's going to go ahead and give us a log output so we can go ahead and tell when Joplin is up running. So let's go ahead and press enter now here, and we can watch the log output as Joplin goes ahead, pulls in, and I'll be back with you when we're ready to log into our Joplin server for the first time. All right, so now the log has stopped really moving. We're ready to go ahead and try logging into our Joplin server for the first time. So up here, we're going to go ahead and create a new tab, and we're going to enter the IP address that we set up for the server, and we'll get a screen that looks like this. For email address, for our initial login, we're going to enter at admin@localhost. and a password of admin. And then we can go ahead and press login. Then we will get a message that tells us we need to change our default login. So let's go ahead and hit change it now. And we need to enter a new password. And then we'll press update profile. And that'll get us so that we now have a new password. And it's time to start looking around and seeing what's here to offer inside of Joplin Server. So let's hit home. And here at home, you get that we have an admin and just some little stat outputs about the max users that are allowed, the max item size, the total sizes of our notebooks and whatnot. Not a lot of information, but just a little bit of information that will be helpful if we're doing things inside of Joplin Server. Here at items, it will tell us once we upload something about notebooks and whatnot. And here at admin, it's going to allow us to create new users, delete users, the tasks that are running on the server, emails, if there's any that are going through the system, and reports. And it does an hour report. And again, we've connected no system to this user, so there'll be no information here. Now let's head back to users so we can create our first user. So we can actually take a look at how to synchronize Joplin here with Joplin Server and start using our newly created Joplin Server. So at the user tab, let's go ahead, press add user, and we'll give it a name of a VE. And now we're going to need to give our Joplin server an email address. Now this email address can be something quite simple like ve@localhost, but it will need a email address or it's going to fail. I'm going to leave the rest of this all as defaults. Feel free to play around with it as you so feel fit in the configuration of your Joplin server. And the last thing we'll need to do is give it a password and press create password. Now with our profile created, when we head back to users, you'll be able to see that we have a second user here, and we can even click on this user to see a little bit more details about that user. Now, for now, we are finished with our setup inside of our Joplin server. So I'll be back with you in a few minutes to look at how to create the synchronization setup for Joplin from a Mac. Now that we have our synchronization server set up here on Proxmox inside of Docker, it's time to look at how to configure Joplin to synchronize. We're going to be looking at Joplin settings for synchronization here on a Mac, and they should be quite similar for your iPhone, Android phone, web interface, or PC. The first thing we're going to need to do is open our Joplin application and go to settings. Here at settings, we're going to click on synchronization, and we're going to then click on synchronization target, and we're changing that to Joplin server. At the Joplin server, it's going to ask for the URL for the server, and the URL for our server is going to be http://192.168.0.6. The email address we set up was ve@localhost, I believe. Yeah, ve@localhost, and then the password. We can change our synchronization settings. I wouldn't go 5 minutes. I'd go at least once an hour. Check synchronization configuration will allow us to make sure, and it says it's successful. And we could take a look at advanced settings, although I don't traditionally configure these. So now we can go ahead and go back, and you can see that it's created remote items. It's fetched information, so it has done a synchronization. We can go ahead and click on it again, and we get that it completed. So going back to our web interface, going to our admin terminal, we should be able to come in here and move around a little bit and see some stuff that's changed. So you can see that our system here under reports has sent some items up, and they're now stored inside. And If we go to home, you should see, so the only place we're seeing is that our system, our user has sent files to the Joplin server, and we are indeed synchronizing here with our Joplin server. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial on how to get Joplin server up and running inside of Docker and synchronizing with your system. Please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to gather more home lab tutorials like this one. As always, have a good night.